You spend most of your life being told how to manage emotions, how to rise above them, how to regulate them, suppress them, defeat them, master them. But here's a truth we rarely sit with long enough. You cannot be free from an experience you refuse to acknowledge you're having. Emotional freedom is not the absence of emotion. It is the absence of fear of emotion. When we push our feelings away, we don't actually get rid of them. We exile them, we take a very human, very temporary internal experience, and we turn it into a shadow identity we carry around. Think about the language we use. I can't handle this. I shouldn't be upset. Why am I like this? Notice the implication. We frame emotions not as data, but as evidence that something has gone wrong inside us. Psychologist Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists," and neuroscience backs him up. Suppressed emotions don't dissolve. They resurface physiologically through stress responses, chronic tension, impulsive behavior, anxiety loops, emotional numbing, burnout, even inflammation. The body keeps score long after the mind tries to change the subject. If you're sad, the goal isn't to trick your brain into believing you're not. The goal is to build the courage to say, without self-betrayal, I am sad right now, and that is not a threat to my survival, nor a flaw in my character. Emotions are not interruptions to clarity. They are contributors to clarity. From a neurological perspective, emotions are predictive processing mechanisms. Your brain is constantly scanning your internal and external environment, trying to assess meaning, risk, belonging, alignment, psychological safety. When an emotion rises, it's not random. It's an internal notification system saying, pay attention to this. Sadness signals loss or longing. Anger rises around violation or unmet needs. Shame appears at the fracture points of belonging and self-concept. Fear flags uncertainty or perceived danger. Joy blooms around connection, resonance, presence. None of these are bugs in the system. They are the system working. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza argued that emotions are not irrational forces to be conquered, but natural states that, when understood, expand human freedom. Freedom, he proposed, comes not from escaping emotional nature, but from interpreting it without delusion. He believed the highest form of self-mastery is emotional comprehension, not emotional eradication. Modern psychology echoes the same idea. Awareness precedes regulation, acceptance precedes transformation, and naming precedes taming. Research in emotional processing shows that simply labeling an emotion reduces amygdala activity, the part of the brain responsible for threat perception. In other words, the moment you name your feeling, your brain stops treating it like an emergency. I'm anxious or I feel ashamed produces a measurable calming effect. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because you stopped being at war with yourself. The opposite of emotional freedom isn't feeling deeply. It's feeling dangerously alone in your feelings. We are a species wired for connection. When emotions overwhelm us, it's usually not because we're feeling too much, but because we're feeling unsupported. That support doesn't always have to come from others. Sometimes it comes from inside, from the self that finally stopped pointing a finger at its own pain. Here's what emotional maturity really sounds like. I can feel this without unraveling. I can experience this without defining myself by it. I can hold this without disappearing from myself. That shift from I must escape this feeling to I can withstand this feeling, that's the threshold where emotional freedom actually begins. But let's go deeper, because self-acceptance isn't just clinical, it's philosophical. To be human is to be permeable. We feel because we care, we hurt because we attach meaning, we grieve because we love, we fear because we hope for futures that matter. The goal of healing is not to become invulnerable to emotion, but responsible to it, not to become emotionless, but unaltered in worth when emotions rise. You are not your trauma, you are not your coping mechanisms, and you are most certainly not the passing emotional weather inside your body. We don't say I am rain just because it's raining. We don't say I am storm just because thunder arrives. We say it's raining, and we keep walking, undisturbed in identity. What would happen if we extended ourselves the same courtesy with emotion? What if, instead of saying I am anxious, you said anxiety is passing through me? instead of I am ashamed? You said shame showed up, and I can investigate it with curiosity instead of collapse, instead of I'm too sensitive. You said I am emotionally attentive, and that is intelligence, not instability. Because when you stop interpreting emotions as indictments, you start interpreting them as instructors. And this is why avoidance is the most expensive human habit we have. It costs us self-trust. It costs us authenticity. It costs us psychological presence, and ultimately, it costs us the opportunity to grow into someone who no longer fears their own interior world. Here's the paradox. The emotions you're most afraid to feel are the emotions that hold the blueprint to your freedom. Not feeling them is the cage. Feeling them without self-abandonment is the escape route. So if emotional freedom is the destination, emotional courage is the vehicle. And emotional honesty is the ignition. The moment you stop fighting what you feel, you stop fighting who you are. And in that moment, healing becomes not a heroic battle, but a human homecoming. You don't have to love every feeling you have. You just have to stop letting your feelings convince you that you're unworthy of love. And here is what I want you to sit with when you leave this room, when you close this tab, when you go back to your real life. Most of us don't notice when it happens, because it doesn't crash into our lives like a crisis. It sneaks in like conditioning. First, we learn to look outward for cues, feedback, reactions, reassurance. Then we start negotiating pieces of ourselves based on what gets rewarded and what gets rejected. Over time, the metric for self-worth shifts from who am I to how am I being perceived, and that shift quietly builds the bars of an emotional prison. The need for approval is not just a social habit, it's a psychological survival strategy we once depended on. As children, belonging was survival. We relied on caregivers and community to mirror back safety, acceptance, love. The brain developed accordingly attuned to faces, tone, inclusion, exclusion. So when we grow up still tracking worth through others' responses, it isn't immaturity. It's outdated adaptation. The problem is, what once helped you belong can later keep you from becoming. Because adulthood demands a new threshold for belonging, one that can't be outsourced. Approval. Seeking gives temporary relief but long-term captivity. Validation is a painkiller, not a cure. The moment you get it, the discomfort quiets, but the moment it fades, the discomfort returns, often louder, because nothing inside you actually strengthened. This is why praise can feel addictive and criticism can feel annihilating. When your identity evaporates under disapproval, it's not because the feedback is powerful. It's because the self underneath it hasn't been given permission to stand without scaffolding. Psychology calls this contingent self-worth, a state where your value is experienced as conditional, earned through external confirmation. Philosophy calls it alienated identity, a life where self-definition is ceded to the collective gaze. Both describe the same human cost. You stop living from the inside out and start performing from the outside in. Erich Fromm warned that freedom is frightening when a person equates love with acceptance from others. If love must be earned, the self must be edited. If the self must be edited, freedom is forfeited. This isn't dramatic. It's mathematical. A person divided against themselves cannot be emotionally whole, and yet we chase approval because it feels like stability. But external validation isn't a foundation. It's a weather vane. It spins with moods, opinions, biases, projections, envy, misunderstanding, admiration, insecurity, cultural expectations, digital echo chambers. Trying to build a life on it is like trying to stand on water and wondering why you keep sinking. Self-acceptance is built on something far less variable, self-sovereignty. The ability to hold an opinion of yourself that does not require a consensus. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or emotionally armored. It means becoming anchored. It means realizing that being seen by everyone is not the same thing as being known by yourself. And the tragedy isn't that some people won't validate you. The tragedy is when you start believing that their validation is more credible than your own internal truth. Consider how often we say we want confidence, but what we're really asking for is not confidence, but insurance. We want guarantees that we'll be liked, supported, admired, understood before we speak, act, or show up authentically. But emotional freedom doesn't come from guarantees. It comes from guts, the willingness to be present in yourself even when the audience isn't applauding. You can't talk about accepting yourself without eventually standing face to face with versions of you that you've spent years trying to outrun. The uninspired one, the insecure one, the avoidant one, the loud one, the quiet one, the messy one, the one who tried too hard, the one who numbed too much, the one who chose poorly, reacted painfully, or loved recklessly. We love the idea of evolution, but we resist the evidence of it. We want to arrive healed, self-possessed, emotionally free, but we struggle to embrace the person we were on the way to becoming that person. Self-acceptance isn't one shift, it's a confrontation, not hostile, but honest. There is a peculiar cruelty in how humans review their past. We don't assess earlier versions of ourselves the way we would assess a friend with context, empathy, develop, mental awareness, environmental understanding. We interrogate them like suspects. We hold their limitations under the glaring light of hindsight, where nothing looks as rational or forgivable as it did when it was lived in real time. But hindsight is not wisdom unless it generates compassion. Otherwise, it's just weaponized clarity. The self that you're ashamed of is not proof that you're defective. It is proof that you grew. Growth is a chronological impossibility without earlier ignorance. You cannot transform out of a self you never were. The person who didn't know better isn't an embarrassment to your story. They're the inciting incident. Yet we punish ourselves for not possessing the emotional literacy, relational skill, boundaries, resilience, or self-knowledge that we only acquired by living through the experiences that demanded them. This kind of self-rejection is not reflective, it's unfair. It retroactively demands competence from a person who is still being forged by trial, friction, and survival. The research is unequivocal. Shame corrodes the self, while self-forgiveness consolidates it. Shame says, you are what you did. Healing says, you are what you learned. Those are entirely different identities. One is a label, one is a trajectory. And here's the deeper psychological truth. When we attack our past selves, what we are really doing is trying to distance ourselves from the vulnerability we still fear we are capable of. By treating the past version as other, we create the illusion that we are no longer fragile, impressionable, capable of poor coping or desperation-driven choices. But self-acceptance does not come from pretending you have changed. It comes from recognizing that you were human even then, and you are human even now. The healed self is not an upgraded operating system with fewer feelings. It's the same system, met with less judgment and more understanding. Because the goal isn't to erase your psychological history, it's to metabolize it without contamination. Philosopher Paul Ricoeur described identity not as a static verdict, but as a story we continuously interpret and reinterpret. You are both the narrator and the text. The suffering begins when you read earlier chapters without hermeneutic generosity, without interpretive mercy. When you reinterpret your past self as someone who is trying to belong, survive, soothe, cope, adapt, defend, or escape pain, you move from measuring moral failure to recognizing adaptive response. You replace condemnation with developmental logic. That is the moment history stops being your captor and starts being your curriculum. The story shifts from "why was I that way" to "of course I became that way." Attachment theory explains that when emotional needs go unmet, children don't stop needing, they start adapting. Trauma psychology explains that when the body feels unsafe, coping strategies form around immediacy, not self-regard. Behavioral science explains that when reinforcement is unpredictable, people perform for approval instead of acting from conviction. Neurobiology explains that when emotions aren't modeled, they aren't named, and therefore feel dangerous when they arise later. None of this is character deficiency. It is human wiring responding to environment. Forgiveness is not sentimental. It's structural, and this structural shift matters because rejecting your past self keeps you tethered to emotional threat. When you finally say, you did the best you could with the tools you had, you are not letting yourself off the hook. You are letting yourself out of the cage. This does not nullify accountability, it contextualizes it. Emotionally free people are not people who made peace instead of learning from their past. They are people who made peace through learning from their past without self-disintegration. There is also a philosophical dimension here that psychology alone cannot capture. A divided self is an existential burden. To reject your past self is to reject the process that produced the current self you're proud of. You can critique your choices without derecognizing the chooser. You can evaluate past coping without amputating the person who coped. They were trying to solve a real pain with the understanding they possessed. They weren't choosing harm, they were trying to select relief. Compassion is not the opposite of truth. It is the completion of it. The emotionally free person is not who you become by defending against your old self. They are who you become by gathering your old self back into your identity without fracture. The past self is not a liability to be disowned. They are a witness you stop putting on trial.